My name cracked through the auditorium like a blade dragged against glass, a sharp, accusing sound under the blistering lights. I stepped onto the stage, spine straight, breath steady, already bracing for the ache I knew was waiting. 8 chairs stood in the family row, neatly labelled with my last name, Caro. 8 perfect reminders of where I supposedly belonged. All 8 stayed empty. No wave, no nod, not even the ghost of a shadow. Just silence, cold, deliberate, while other families roared their pride like a victory anthem. I felt something inside me tilt, then settle into a familiar, bitter calm. I even laughed once softly because what else was left? Then I kept walking. Retribution has a long memory. 8 months later, my $5 million penthouse reached the real estate pages. And that was when the first message finally surfaced. Family dinner, 6 p.m. Important discussion. Important, of course. I showed up, though not in the way they expected. My name is Susan, and for as long as I've known myself, I learned to shrink, to take up as little space as possible within the walls that should have sheltered me. No one told me outright. The rules were older than my childhood, etched into the air, the furniture, the steady drip of comparison. Jessica, the eldest, shone so brightly she blinded everyone to the cracks beneath. Thomas, the youngest, was the fragile prince, protected even from the consequences he crafted with his own hands. And me? I was the gap filler, the quiet fix, the pair of steady hands ready to patch every hole left by someone else. Personal justice was never part of the script. The pattern began early. I remember Jessica forgetting her science project the morning it was due. Tears, panic, a small domestic apocalypse. Without thinking, I offered mine, the one I'd spent a week building. Jessica won second place. No one asked why I turned in nothing. Mom just smiled and said, "Susan always figures things out." Her voice warm with praise that felt more like punishment, an open wound disguised as affection. Years later, when I finally landed my first job, I saved for a small set of drafting tools, the first real investment in a dream I barely dared to name. Before I could open the box, Dad asked to borrow the money to cover a bill Jessica had forgotten. "You're responsible," he murmured, already pocketing the cash. "She has a good heart. She just needs time." His jaw tightened in irritation when I hesitated, and I learned, again, that swallowing my needs was easier than watching his disappointment sharpen into blame. Birthdays followed the same script. I baked a chocolate cake, Mum's favourite. Jessica arrived late with a box of store-bought cookies. Mum kissed her cheek as if Jessica had brought an offering carved from gold. "You always think of the sweetest things," she cooed. I stood there holding the cake server, invisible, erased without effort. But the memory that still burns, the one that forged my pent-up rage into something sharper than grief, came later. I was in that freezing studio I could barely afford, wrapped in 2 jackets, hunched over a chipped desk, revising a duplex floor plan I hoped would be my first real breakthrough. Rent notices blinked on my phone like threats. I called Dad, not for money, just advice, just his voice. He answered with a sigh that cut deeper than shouting. "Real estate is for men who understand numbers, Susan. Try something safer." Then he hung up. That night, the stitching on my black portfolio tore open. I could have thrown it away. Instead, I sat under the weak lamp, sewing it shut by hand, each push of the needle steady but shaking. That portfolio became my quiet rebellion, my punishment and my promise, my reminder of every betrayal, every unresolved grievance. And then came graduation. My name thundered across the stadium, applause rising like a tide. I turned toward the family section, toward 8 chairs bearing my last name. All 8 empty. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. After that, 8 months slipped by in clean silence. No comparisons, no dismissal. I worked. I saved. I signed every deal I could touch. I told them nothing. Silence tasted like freedom, and like the first step toward retribution. One afternoon, parked in my old Honda outside a job site, reviewing a revised valuation, my phone lit up with a notification, an article forwarded from a colleague whose face I barely remembered. I opened it without thinking, and that was the spark that would set everything simmering beneath my ribs back into motion. The headline glared back at me like a verdict. Local developer transforms 5 to penthouse. Project reshapes Greybridge Market. And beneath it, bold and unmistakable, my name. The photo showed the building I'd rebuilt brick by brick, each inch a piece of quiet retribution stitched into steel and glass. The article listed timelines, numbers, projected returns. My private battles turned into public data. My phone buzzed again and again, a flood of forwarded links and congratulations from acquaintances who barely remembered my face. None of the messages came from my family. Their silence had a particular weight, one I'd learned to read like a coded threat. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and stared through the windshield. The clouds dragged slowly across the late afternoon sky, as if the world itself paused, waiting to see what I would do with this small, brutal victory. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel relieved. I just felt still in the way a blade stays perfectly motionless before delivering its punishment. Then, the phone vibrated once more. My father's name lit up the screen. The message was short, clipped, written in the same tone he used when asking me to clean up someone else's mess. Family dinner. 6 p.m. Important discussion. No greeting, no warmth. Not even the pretense of affection. Just a summons. A call to duty disguised as family. A second message followed almost instantly. Don't be late. I held the phone between my fingers, letting the weight of 8 silent months press through the glass like a thumb on a bruise. This wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't remorse. It was a transaction. They needed something, and I had suddenly become useful. I inhaled once through my nose, let my shoulders settle into that old, conditioned rhythm of obedience, and typed the only response that didn't betray even a flicker of desperation. I'll be there. I dropped the phone back onto the seat, started the engine, and watched the first streetlights spark to life as the sky slid toward dusk. Whatever they wanted, whatever new betrayal was waiting under the guise of discussion, they had already revealed the truth. They only remembered me when the world did. The message stayed glowing on my screen long after the engine trembled into silence. Another notification, another article, another forwarded link, another stranger congratulating me. The world suddenly had a great deal to say. So did my family. Convenient timing. But I didn't drive home. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward the small lot behind my office building, a quiet, forgotten place none of them had ever bothered to visit. Greybridge was sinking into that bluish-grey fog that made the city feel softer than it was, like a place holding its breath before a storm. I locked the car, climbed the narrow stairs, and let the heavy door shut behind me with a satisfying thud. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights settled into my bones, steady, indifferent, familiar. I placed my black portfolio on the desk, the same one I had stitched by hand on that frozen night years ago. The crooked seam was still there, stubborn and ugly, a monument to a past they had never cared to see. I opened it carefully. Paper whispered against paper, contracts, valuations, spreadsheets, progress reports. My life, measured in signatures and dates. Not a single sheet owed anything to my family. I didn't feel anger, not exactly. I felt precision, sharp, balanced, ready. The kind of quiet clarity people only gain after enough betrayal leaves nothing but clean, steady lines behind. I powered on my laptop. The gentle whir of the fan filled the room. My fingers moved automatically, reviewing ledgers, payments, line items due to close within 6 weeks. Numbers steadied me in a way people never had. Email, spreadsheet, signed, filed, archived, deleted. Each action landed like a heartbeat, controlled and deliberate. By 6:42 p.m, I stood and crossed to the long window overlooking the city. The office building across the street glowed amber, each pane of glass a softened square of light. My reflection hovered there, creased blazer, hair tied back, exhaustion sharpening the angles of my face. The face of a woman who had earned every inch of the penthouse, the headline couldn't stop repeating. I watched my reflection breathe. I hadn't done that in a long time. My phone vibrated on the desk, once, twice. A congratulatory message from a downtown firm. Then a reporter asking for a quote. Then another. My phone skittered across the wood like a frightened creature trembling with the sudden attention. And beneath it all, a quiet ember of pent-up rage glowed, patient and observant, waiting for the moment it would finally be put to use. I flipped the phone onto its screen and muted it. The quiet returned, dense, deliberate. The kind of quiet that invites strategy. Their sudden interest was only noise. This silence was where plans sharpened. I settled back into my chair and drew out the acquisition file I'd finalized that morning. The commercial plaza that had devoured 4 months of relentless work. Countless walkthroughs. Endless arguments with inspectors. Nights where the only illumination was my desk lamp and the cold bite of ambition. It was, without question, the most crucial purchase I had ever secured, and I was well aware of its gravitational pull. In Greybridge real estate, that plaza was a linchpin. Every major development whispered around it. I didn't need confirmation that my father and Anthony had their eyes on it. In this city, the truth travels in low tones, shared between people who assume you're too small to matter. I brushed my fingers along the final signature, feeling the pressure I'd pressed into the page. They wanted me at dinner. They wanted something substantial, something they believed they could extract from me, the way they always had. But I wasn't walking into an argument. I was walking into clarity, and, potentially, retribution. I reread the terms, scrutinized each clause, confirmed every closing condition. When I was satisfied, I slid the contract into my black portfolio and pressed it flat. The gesture felt like locking a vault. Outside the window, the sky had shifted into a deep, cold blue. By 7:19 p.m., the last streaks of daylight had vanished. I reached for my coat, then paused. Something about it felt sentimental, soft. I left it on the hook. I didn't need comfort, only purpose. I walked down the hall, the motion-triggered lights fading behind me, as if the building were folding itself into darkness. My Honda sat waiting in the small lot, paint worn, headlights dim, steadfast in ways my family had never been. I opened the passenger door, set the portfolio carefully on the seat, and climbed in. For a moment, I watched Greybridge settling into night, the thinning traffic, the flickering neon signs, the restless autumn wind. All of it felt familiar, the terrain I'd crossed again and again to build something no one believed I could. As I merged onto the freeway, the city unfurled beneath me. I passed buildings I'd remodeled, streets where I'd once stood shivering at bus stops because no one in my family had ever thought to offer a ride. I crossed the bridge I'd walked during storms, soaked and exhausted, because independence had been forced onto me long before it became a choice. Every landmark hummed with its own memory. Here's where you weren't. Here's where I learned survival. Here's where your neglect became my fuel. I touched the stitched seam of my portfolio, feeling the crooked line under my fingertips, a scar from that winter night when I sewed it shut by hand. Rage had threaded each stitch, the boiling hatred of being dismissed, underestimated, erased. That seam had held ever since. I didn't rehearse what I'd say at dinner. What was the point? Words slid off them like water off polished stone. They talked over apologies, hollowed out explanations, rewrote every boundary I ever tried to place. Eventually, I'd stopped offering anything they could twist. Tonight, I wasn't bringing emotions. I was bringing evidence. When I turned into my parents' neighborhood, I slowed. The houses sat in perfect rows, like a row of spectators waiting for drama they thought they understood. Porch lights blinked on, one by one, as the last of daylight sank behind the hill. I pulled into their driveway at 6:59 p.m. Punctuality, the one virtue my father respected, but only when it served him. Warm, gold light spilled from the windows, heavy with old rituals and older expectations. Through the dining room window, I saw blurred shapes, Jessica leaning forward, animated, Thomas gesturing with restless hands, Dad pacing with the sharp impatience of a man who believed he controlled the room. They had no idea what waited in the passenger seat of my car. I straightened my blazer, drew in one slow breath, and stepped out into the cool evening. They wanted to discuss something important. Good. So did I. The door opened before I reached it. My father stood there, posture stiff, expression trimmed into something resembling professionalism. "You're right on time," he said, stepping aside. No warmth, no acknowledgement of absence, just approval for punctuality. The dining room looked like a corporate war room. Jessica sat upright, swirling wine with rehearsed elegance. Thomas lounged, tapping his fingers against the table. Anthony adjusted his tie, preparing his pitch. My mother hovered, smiling too brightly. Fragile, brittle. I took the seat they'd left open, farthest from the head of the table. A seating plan that spoke louder than their voices ever had. Dad cleared his throat. "Let's get to the point. We've come across an opportunity." Anthony leaned in, fingers steepled, the confidence of a man expecting an easy win. A redevelopment in the warehouse district. And in that moment, I felt the quiet bloom of grim atonement settle into place. Prime land, strong forecasts. We're ready to launch, but we need the capital secured. They delivered it like a verdict, not a request. No hesitation, no awareness of the irony. Dad gave a firm nod, as if everything was already decided. "We thought this would be a good opportunity for a family partnership. You provide the funding, we'll steer the development, everyone wins." Jessica tilted her glass, studying the wine like it mattered more than me. "It's honestly generous, considering how early you are in your career." Thomas smirked. "Yeah, you'd get to watch how real developers work." My mother placed a hand on my arm, her touch gentle but empty. "Sweetheart, this is your chance to be part of something larger than yourself." Their voices layered like overlapping static, drowning the room. Not a single apology, not a single moment of reflection, just expectation, polished and entitled, drifting from one person to the next. They talked as if the roast on the table mattered more than the daughter they'd ignored. I lifted my black portfolio and set it onto the table. The sound was soft, yet final enough to slice the room in half. Everything froze. "I did come for an important conversation," I said. "Just not the one you're having." Dad stiffened. "Susan, we don't have time for—" I opened the portfolio. The clasp clicked, clean, metallic, impossible to talk over. A stack of documents slid into the candlelight, their edges reflecting faint glints of gold, like polished armor. Anthony leaned forward, suspicion tightening his features. "Is that the plaza?" "The commercial plaza everyone's been stalking like vultures," I said. Dad scoffed. "Come on, that property isn't even—" "It was available," I said. 4 months ago." I placed the signed acquisition documents in the center of the table, rotating them so they faced my family. Their reflections ghosted across the glossy paper, distorted, wavering. Jessica stopped breathing mid-sip. Thomas's chair gave a long, low groan. My father's jaw locked so hard it looked painful. Anthony reached for the papers with unsteady fingers, the kind of tremor men get when they realize the battlefield has shifted under their feet. "You purchased it," he whispered. "All of it." 100%, I confirmed, which means your warehouse district redevelopment has no anchor tenant. And without an anchor, you won't get a single lender, investor, or permit. Dad's voice dropped to something colder, more unfamiliar. "Why would you do this? You knew we were pursuing it." "No," I said. "I knew the market was pursuing it. And unlike you, I don't wait to be invited." My mother's voice cracked. "Susan, we're still a family." "A family shows up," I said. You didn't show up for anything that mattered. Not my graduation, not my milestones, just the headlines. Silence swelled, thick and suffocating, swallowing their excuses before they could form. I stacked the documents neatly, slid them back into the portfolio, and closed it with a soft, decisive click, the sound of a door closing forever. You wanted an important discussion, I said. This was mine. Dad's shoulders sagged, the first sign of gravity in his posture. Jessica stared at her plate, her face stripped of the usual ease. Thomas muttered a curse into his glass. Anthony leaned back, ashen, calculating the fallout. I stood, smoothing the collar of my blazer, the gesture I always used at the end of lost causes. Dinner's all yours, I said. But the future? That belongs to me? No one followed. No one protested. They stayed frozen in their seats, a tableau of shock and overdue silence. Outside, the night hit me with a cold, honest edge. The porch light buzzed overhead, flickering the way it always had when I was 16, waiting for someone to notice I was standing there. I paused on the steps, letting the last warmth from the house slide off my skin, letting the clean air replace it with something steadier. Then I walked to my Honda, opened the door, and slipped inside. The scent of old upholstery and half-faded vanilla wrapped around me, grounding me more than any family embrace ever had. Through the windshield, the dining room window glowed. Shadows moved, someone pacing, someone shrinking into their chair. But I heard nothing. The silence was mine. Finally. My phone buzzed once, a text from my mother. We didn't know how to fix things. Please don't give up on us. I didn't open it, didn't erase it, just turned the phone face down. I started the engine and drove through streets etched into my childhood, past the corner store where Jessica once left me, waiting in the cold, the park where Thomas bragged about being untouchable, the hill that punished me every time I walked it alone. Each place looked smaller now, less threatening, less important. By the time I reached downtown, the city lights had risen, white, gold, and steady. My penthouse towered at the end of the block, its glass reflecting the glow like a beacon, like a life I had forged without them, a life they could no longer claim. I parked, stepped into the elevator, and let it carry me upward in a quiet, steady climb. When I unlocked the door, the silence that greeted me wasn't the brittle, suffocating kind that lived in my parents' house. This silence was spacious, clean, a silence that belonged to me. I set the portfolio on the kitchen island. The crooked seam caught the light, casting a narrow shadow across the marble, like a small scar finally telling its truth. I traced it with one fingertip, remembering the night I'd sewn it shut in that freezing studio, the thread stiff between my shaking hands, the air biting at my skin. Back then, silence felt like exile. Tonight, it felt like precision. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my forehead gently against the cool glass. Below me, the city unfurled, steady, endless, stripped of the noise that used to drown me. Greybridge breathed without expectation, without judgment, without the weight of someone else's disappointment. For the first time in years, I felt no impulse to defend myself, no urgency to justify my choices, no invisible jury waiting to rule on my worth. I understood something simple and devastatingly clear. Silence never wounds on its own. It's the people who break it, carelessly, selfishly, only when they need something, who carve the hurt into you. The glass held my reflection faintly, not fractured, not blurred by anyone else's shadow, just my outline. Still, unbowed, fully my own. All my life, I'd kept saving seats for people who never took them. I held spaces open, waited for apologies that never arrived, left entire chapters blank so someone else could choose when to enter. Tonight, I finally understood the truth I'd been circling for years. Boundaries aren't an act of cruelty. They're the quiet doors we close so our lives can breathe again. I stepped back from the window, letting the city's glow settle behind me. Then, one by one, I turned off the lights. Darkness pulled softly through the penthouse, not the fearful void I once ran from, but an earned calm, a dusk stitched together by survival, I stood in it for a long moment, listening to the steady hum of my own breath. If you've ever rebuilt yourself in the silence someone else abandoned you with, if you've ever used that emptiness as scaffolding instead of shackles, tell me where you're listening from. Some stories don't begin with forgiveness. Some begin the moment you stop waiting for anyone to show up.